Christopher Langley had spent weeks planning the perfect anniversary trip for his wife, Vanessa. A secluded 5-star resort on the coast, candlelit dinners, and spa treatments, everything designed to reignite the spark they had lost over the years. To the outside world, they were a power couple. Christopher, a highly respected architect, and Vanessa, a successful attorney. Their marriage seemed unshakable, built on years of love, trust, and shared ambition. But behind closed doors, things were different. Vanessa had grown distant, distracted by work and late-night meetings. Christopher, feeling the weight of their emotional disconnect, had found solace elsewhere. Her name was Elise. A striking woman in her late 20s, Elise had started as an intern at Christopher's firm. Their professional relationship had blurred into something more over long meetings and stolen glances. She made him feel wanted, alive, in ways Vanessa hadn't in years. What began as an innocent flirtation quickly spiraled into a passionate affair. On the night of their anniversary, Christopher and Vanessa checked into the resort. Vanessa, exhausted from work, wanted nothing more than to relax. Christopher, on the other hand, had other plans. He had booked a separate villa, just a few minutes away from their suite, where Elise was waiting for him. Under the pretense of a late-night walk to clear his head, Christopher slipped away to see her. Elise was waiting on the balcony, the ocean breeze playing with her dark curls, her lips curling into a knowing smile as he stepped inside. "You made it," she whispered, pulling him close. Christopher silenced her with a kiss, the guilt momentarily drowned by desire. This was his escape, his refuge from the cold, distant marriage he no longer recognized. They spent the night together, tangled in sheets and secrecy. Meanwhile, Vanessa lay awake in their suite, her instincts telling her something was off. She glanced at the clock, 1:30 a.m., and Christopher was still gone. Her mind raced. Had he really gone for a walk? Or was there another reason for his absence? The next morning, Christopher returned, slipping back into bed just as the sun began to rise. He kissed Vanessa's forehead as if nothing had happened. But she wasn't asleep. She felt the unfamiliar scent of perfume on his skin, the faintest trace of deception. She didn't say a word, but something inside her shifted. That afternoon, while Christopher was out taking a call, Vanessa did something she had never done before. She checked his phone. It was locked, of course, but she knew his passcode. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through his messages. And there it was. Hundreds of texts. Rendezvous planned in hushed tones. Elise's name appearing over and over again, accompanied by messages that made Vanessa's stomach churn. She swallowed the lump in her throat and clenched her jaw. Her mind raced with the weight of betrayal. She had suspected, but now she knew. Vanessa put the phone down and exhaled shakily. She had two choices, confront him or bide her time. And as she sat there, fury and devastation coiling inside her like a viper, she knew one thing for certain. Christopher had no idea what was coming. And neither did Elise. Elise had no idea what was coming. Vanessa spent the rest of the day in calculated silence, playing the role of the devoted wife while the fury inside her simmered, dark and unrelenting. Every glance Christopher cast her way, every casual touch, felt like a fresh betrayal. Yet she smiled through it, her mind crafting a plan so methodical, so precise, that even Christopher, with all his cleverness, wouldn't see it coming. That evening, Christopher suggested a romantic dinner at the resort's exclusive oceanfront restaurant. Vanessa agreed, her voice smooth and composed. She let him believe that she was none the wiser, that she was still the trusting wife he had deceived so easily. She wore a black silk dress, the very one he had bought for her years ago, back when their love had been genuine. She let him wrap his arm around her waist as they walked into the restaurant. She let him pour her wine. She even let herself laugh at his jokes. But her mind was elsewhere. Elise. She was staying in a private villa just minutes away, waiting for Christopher, unaware that her world was about to collapse. Vanessa had made sure of that. She excused herself midway through dinner, murmuring something about fresh air, and slipped away before Christopher could protest. She moved through the resort with quiet precision, her heartbeat steady, her hands cold but steady. She had always been the kind of woman who thought 10 steps ahead. Courtrooms had trained her well. But this wasn't just strategy. This was personal. The villa's door was slightly ajar when Vanessa arrived. Elise had left it open, expecting Christopher. Vanessa pushed it wider, stepping inside without hesitation. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with the ocean air, a scent she now despised. Elise turned from where she stood by the bed, her expression shifting from anticipation to confusion. "Vanessa," she said hesitantly. Vanessa closed the door behind her. The click of the lock echoed through the dimly lit room. "You don't look surprised to see me," Vanessa said, her voice eerily calm. Elise hesitated, the flicker of guilt crossing her face. "Save it," Vanessa cut her off. "I know everything." Elise swallowed hard, stepping back. "Listen, Vanessa, it wasn't." "Wasn't what?" "Serious, meaningful, real." Vanessa tilted her head, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Because it certainly seemed real in those texts. The late-night meetings, the sneaking around, the desperate little rendezvous while I was home, being the dutiful wife. Elise's lips parted, but no words came. Vanessa took another step closer, her presence suffocating. "Did you enjoy it?" she asked, tilting her head. "Stealing what wasn't yours? Sleeping with a man who swore loyalty to someone else?" Elise's breath hitched. Vanessa's laughter was soft, almost melodic. "You're scared. Good. You should be." Elise's eyes darted toward the door, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But before she could move, Vanessa reached into her bag and pulled out a small, sleek blade. The sight of it made Elise freeze. "Vanessa." "Sure." Vanessa lifted a finger to her lips. "Don't scream. We wouldn't want to ruin the night, would we?" Elise backed up until she hit the edge of the bed, her breath ragged. "You don't have to do this." Vanessa smiled, twirling the blade between her fingers. "Oh, but I do." Back at the restaurant, Christopher was growing restless. Vanessa had been gone too long. He checked his watch, a frown creasing his brow. Something didn't feel right. His phone buzzed. A message. "Unknown number. You should come to the villa." Christopher's blood ran cold. He stood abruptly, ignoring the confused stares of the other diners, and made his way out of the restaurant, his pulse hammering in his ears. By the time he reached the villa, the door was ajar, just as Vanessa had found it. A foreboding sense of dread curled around him as he stepped inside. The first thing he saw was Elise. She was on the floor, trembling, her wide eyes glistening with unshed tears. The blade lay inches from her, tainted red. And then he saw Vanessa. She stood in the center of the room, calm and composed, wiping the blade clean with a silk handkerchief as if it were nothing more than a courtroom exhibit. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Happy anniversary, darling." Vanessa didn't regret what she had done. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Elise was alive. Barely. The wound wasn't fatal, just deep enough to leave a lasting scar. A reminder. A warning. The blood had soaked into the pristine white carpet of the villa, a crimson stain that mirrored the rage Vanessa had felt in those moments. Christopher had reacted exactly as she had expected. Shocked. Panicked. Desperate. He had dropped to his knees beside Elise, pressing his hands against the wound, whispering frantic reassurances. But Vanessa had merely watched, her expression unreadable, her pulse steady. She had texted him from Elise's phone, leading him here. Making sure he saw, making sure he understood just how far she was willing to go. Now, standing in the doorway, she tilted her head as she studied him. He had been so confident in his lies, so assured in his deception. Did he still think he had control? "Vanessa," Christopher rasped, his hands slick with Elise's blood. "What have you done?" Vanessa exhaled slowly, stepping forward. "What I had to." Elise whimpered, clutching her side, her face twisted in pain. But Vanessa ignored her. This wasn't about her, not anymore. Elise was just a symptom. Christopher was the disease. "We need to call someone," Christopher said. "She needs help." Vanessa smirked. Oh, now you care about someone other than yourself? Christopher's jaw clenched. This isn't a game. No, Vanessa agreed, crouching beside him, her fingers ghosting over his shoulder. It's a reckoning. She stood abruptly and tossed a phone onto the bed. Call for help if you want. But know this, when that ambulance arrives, so does the truth. About Elise. About the others. About you. Christopher's breath hitched. What? Vanessa crossed her arms. Oh, don't act surprised. You really thought Elise was the only one. His silence was answer enough. Vanessa laughed softly, the sound dripping with bitterness. You're pathetic, Christopher. You think you're clever, juggling women like they're disposable. But you underestimated me. I know everything. She turned, walking to the door, pausing only to glance back over her shoulder. Make your choice. Save her, and lose everything. Or let her bleed, and keep your secrets for a little while longer. Then she was gone, the night swallowing her whole. Christopher sat frozen, his mind racing. The weight of his sins crushed down on him, suffocating. Elise whimpered again, her breathing shallow. His fingers hovered over the phone. One call, and his entire world would crumble. Vanessa had ensured that. Vanessa watched Christopher with cold, unwavering eyes as he stood frozen in the doorway of the villa. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Elise whimpered from her position on the floor, clutching her side where a deep but non-fatal wound marred her flawless skin. The blade Vanessa had used lay discarded between them, gleaming under the dim villa lights. Christopher finally found his voice. What the hell have you done? Vanessa exhaled slowly, her lips curving into a wry smile. Something you should have expected the moment you decided to betray me. His gaze flickered from Elise to Vanessa, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a vice. His mind raced for a way out, for a way to undo the chaos unraveling before him. Vanessa, put the knife down. We can talk about this. She let out a soft chuckle. Talk? Oh, Christopher, we're far past that. Did you think I would just sit back and let you humiliate me? Let you parade around with these other women like I was some kind of fool? No, darling. I'm going to teach you what betrayal feels like. Elise whimpered again, dragging herself toward the wall, her breathing ragged. Vanessa barely spared her a glance. Don't be so dramatic, Elise. If I wanted you dead, you'd already be bleeding out. This was just a warning. Christopher took a step forward, his hands raised as if to calm a wild animal. Please, Vanessa. Let's be rational. Rational. She tilted her head. You mean like when you rationalized sleeping with half the women in your social circle? Like that. A flicker of guilt passed over Christopher's face, but he didn't get the chance to answer. Vanessa turned her gaze to Elise. Get out. Before I change my mind and do something permanent. Elise didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled to her feet, one hand pressing against her wound as she stumbled toward the door, nearly tripping in her haste. The second she was gone, silence settled between Vanessa and Christopher like an unspoken declaration of war. Vanessa took a step toward him, and for the first time, Christopher felt a sliver of fear creep down his spine. You think this is over? She asked, her voice dangerously soft. No, my love. This is just beginning. Over the next week, Christopher found himself trapped in a nightmare of Vanessa's making. It started with his business. Investors pulled out of deals at the last second, citing vague concerns. Clients canceled contracts with no warning. His reputation, once pristine, was suddenly under scrutiny. Vanessa, with her sharp mind and years of legal expertise, had moved swiftly and efficiently, cutting him off at the knees before he even realized what was happening. Then came the women. Elise had disappeared, her silence telling enough. But the others, Samantha, Julia, and Colette, each received an anonymous tip about Christopher's various affairs. Private messages, incriminating photos, and carefully constructed narratives designed to destroy whatever standing he had left. The fallout was immediate. They turned against him, furious at his deception, and soon, the whispers began to spread. Christopher was unraveling, and Vanessa was savoring every second of it. One evening, as he sat in his study with a half-empty glass of whiskey in his trembling hands, Vanessa entered the room. She was wearing the same black silk dress from the night at the resort, her every step measured and deliberate. She took the glass from his grip and studied him with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. "How does it feel?" she asked, swirling the amber liquid before taking a sip herself. Christopher swallowed hard. "Vanessa, please. I made a mistake. Several mistakes. But you're destroying my life." She raised a delicate brow. "Oh, darling. That was always the point." "I loved you," he choked out. Vanessa let out a low, humorless laugh. "No, Christopher. You loved the idea of me. The wife who stood by you no matter what. The woman who would accept your lies and smile for the cameras. But that woman doesn't exist anymore. You killed her the moment you decided I wasn't enough." He reached for her hand, desperation in his eyes. "Can we fix this?" For a moment, something flickered in Vanessa's gaze. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. She leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead, and whispered, "No." Then she left, her perfume lingering in the air like a final goodbye. The last straw came 2 nights later. Christopher awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. He groggily reached for it, his vision still blurred from sleep. As he swiped to answer, his blood ran cold at the words flashing across the screen. Confidential files leaked. Financial fraud, infidelity, and more. The downfall of Christopher Pierce. He shot up in bed, his heart pounding. Clicking the link, he was met with a full exposé detailing not only his affairs but damning evidence of financial misdeeds, some fabricated, some disturbingly real. Photos, emails, bank statements. Everything meticulously arranged for maximum devastation. A chill ran through him as realization dawned. Vanessa. Within minutes, his phone erupted with calls. His lawyer. Business associates. Reporters. He could already see the walls closing in, his carefully constructed empire collapsing brick by brick. And then, as if on cue, Vanessa walked into the bedroom, dressed in an elegant silk robe, a glass of wine in her hand. She leaned against the doorway, watching him with something akin to amusement. "Good morning, darling," she said sweetly. "Rough night." He gaped at her. You did this." She took a slow sip of her wine. "Of course I did. Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice was hoarse, shaking. Vanessa tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I simply returned the favor, Christopher. You tore apart our marriage with lies and deceit. I just made sure the world saw you for what you really are." He stood, his hands clenched into fists. "You ruined me." She smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't cruel or triumphant. It was soft, almost sad. "No, darling. You ruined yourself. I just lit the match." As she walked away, leaving Christopher alone in the wreckage of his own making, he realized that Vanessa had never planned to kill him. No, her revenge was far worse. She had taken everything he had ever valued, and left him with nothing but his own regret. Christopher sat alone in his now nearly empty office, the once luxurious space stripped of its former glory. The walls, once adorned with accolades and framed business achievements, were now bare. His desk, which had been a symbol of power, was void of the papers and contracts that once dictated his empire. The only thing that remained was a bottle of whiskey and a single glass. He poured himself another drink, his hands trembling. His phone had been buzzing non-stop for days, but he had stopped answering. His reputation was in ruins. His business was crumbling. His so-called friends had turned their backs on him. And Vanessa. Vanessa had orchestrated every moment of his downfall with a precision that both terrified and fascinated him. A knock at the door shattered his silence. Christopher didn't respond. He already knew who it was. The door creaked open, and Vanessa stepped inside, exuding the same composed elegance she had always carried. She shut the door behind her, taking in the scene before her with a slow, satisfied smirk. "Christopher," she said softly, her voice almost sympathetic. "You look awful." He scoffed, taking a deep sip of whiskey before setting the glass down with a sharp clink. "What do you want, Vanessa? Are you here to gloat? To watch me drown?" She stepped closer, perching on the edge of his desk. "I don't need to gloat. Your destruction speaks for itself." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his face with his hands. "You got what you wanted. You took everything from me. Are you satisfied?" Vanessa leaned forward, her voice lowering to a whisper. "Not yet." Christopher looked up at her, something between fear and curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What more could you possibly take?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded document, placing it in front of him. "Sign it." He hesitated before picking it up. As his eyes scanned the contents, his stomach twisted. Divorce papers. Not just any divorce papers, ones that left him with almost nothing. Every asset, every investment, even the house he had bought years ago, would belong to Vanessa. He let out a bitter laugh. "You want me to sign everything over to you?" She shrugged. "Think of it as reparations for the years of lies." He tossed the papers aside. "You're insane if you think I'm going to agree to this." Vanessa sighed, as if she had expected this. She pulled out her phone and, with a few taps, turned the screen toward him. A video played, one of Christopher, intoxicated and in the company of someone he should have never been seen with. A scandalous, compromising clip, one that would leave no room for redemption. "You see, Christopher," she murmured, "you don't have a choice. You either sign, or I release this. And trust me, after everything else, this will be the final nail in your coffin." He stared at the screen, his hands clenching into fists. "You set me up." She tilted her head. "No, darling. You set yourself up. I just made sure there was a camera to catch it." Christopher knew he had lost. He grabbed a pen, his grip tightening as he signed away the last remnants of his life. As he finished, Vanessa picked up the papers, satisfied. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Vanessa, was it worth it? Destroying me? Was it worth all of this?" She studied him for a long moment before standing up. "You tell me, was she worth it? Were any of them worth it?" Christopher had no answer. And Vanessa didn't wait for one. She walked to the door, pausing only briefly. "Goodbye, Christopher." As she disappeared down the hall, leaving him alone in the ruins of his own making, he realized that his punishment had not been death. It was living with the consequences of his betrayal. Christopher sat in the dimly lit hotel room, the curtains drawn to block out the outside world. The air was thick with the scent of whiskey and regret, the remnants of his downfall scattered around him in the form of empty bottles and crumpled papers. His empire had crumbled, his reputation was in shambles, and the walls felt as if they were closing in on him. He had once been a man of power, of influence, but now, he was nothing more than a shadow of his former self. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, but he ignored it. He already knew what it was: more messages from creditors, more threats from former allies who had turned their backs on him the moment things went south. And Vanessa. He didn't even want to think about Vanessa. She had orchestrated his downfall so meticulously, so flawlessly, that he almost had to admire her for it. Almost. A sharp knock at the door startled him. He sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He wasn't expecting anyone. With a heavy sigh, he dragged himself to the door and opened it just enough to see who was on the other side. Lena stood there, her expression unreadable. She had been one of the many, one of the women he had betrayed Vanessa with. But unlike the others, she hadn't disappeared when things went south. "Christopher," she said, her voice quiet yet firm. "We need to talk." He hesitated before stepping aside, allowing her to enter. She moved past him, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she surveyed the mess around her. "You look like hell." "Thanks," he muttered, shutting the door behind her. "What do you want, Lena?" She turned to face him, arms crossed. I want to know what you're going to do next. He scoffed, pouring himself another drink. Do next? There's nothing left to do. Vanessa made sure of that. Lena sighed, stepping closer. So that's it? You're just going to sit here and drown yourself in alcohol? She shook her head. That's not the Christopher I knew. He took a sip, narrowing his eyes at her. The Christopher you knew was a liar and a cheat. That man got what he deserved. Maybe, she admitted. But that doesn't mean you have to go down without a fight. He chuckled darkly. And what exactly do you suggest I do? Beg for forgiveness? Try to rebuild from nothing? Vanessa owns everything. Even if I wanted to start over, I have nothing left. Lena reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, tossing it onto the table in front of him. Not exactly nothing. Christopher frowned, setting his glass down before picking up the folder. As he flipped through the pages, his expression shifted from confusion to intrigue. Where did you get this? He asked. Does it matter? She countered. It's proof that Vanessa wasn't just out for revenge. She had help. She planned your downfall, but she didn't do it alone. If you play this right, you might just be able to turn things around. Christopher exhaled, closing the folder and looking up at her. And why would you help me? What's in it for you? Lena smirked. Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see Vanessa fall. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. All right, Lena. Let's see just how deep this goes. For the first time in weeks, Christopher felt something other than despair. He felt purpose. Christopher sat in the dimly lit corner of a rundown bar, a stark contrast to the high-end establishments he once frequented. His expensive suit, now wrinkled and stained, did little to mask the downfall of the man who had once ruled over his business empire with an iron fist. The divorce had left him stripped of everything, his wealth, his reputation, his dignity. And yet, the weight of his downfall wasn't just financial. It was psychological. Vanessa had destroyed him with meticulous precision, leaving nothing behind but a hollow shell of the man he used to be. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass before downing it in one gulp, wincing as the alcohol burned his throat. The bartender, a gruff-looking man with a knowing smirk, poured him another without being asked. You look like a man who's lost it all, the bartender muttered, wiping down the counter with a rag that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Christopher exhaled a bitter laugh. You have no idea. The bartender shrugged. Women, money, power. It always ends the same for men like you. Christopher's grip tightened around the glass. He wanted to lash out, to argue, to defend himself. But what was there left to defend? He had lost everything, and Vanessa had made sure that he could never climb his way back up. She had orchestrated his ruin so thoroughly that even the people who once groveled at his feet now spat at his name. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a woman sliding onto the bar stool beside him. She had piercing green eyes, a slow, knowing smile, and an air of danger that Christopher couldn't ignore. Rough night? She asked, her voice smooth like silk. Christopher eyed her warily before nodding. Rough year. She smirked. I know who you are, Christopher. Everyone does. The man who had it all and lost it in the blink of an eye. He exhaled sharply. Are you here to mock me like everyone else? If so, get in line. The woman shook her head, tapping her manicured nails against her glass. No, I'm here because I think you might be useful. And I think you might be desperate enough to listen. Christopher's gaze darkened. Who are you? She leaned in slightly, her scent intoxicating, her smile wicked. Someone who knows what it feels like to be betrayed. And someone who believes in revenge. He scoffed. Revenge is a fool's game. Vanessa won. There's no coming back from this. The woman tilted her head. That's where you're wrong. Vanessa thinks she's won, but she's made one mistake. She left you alive. Christopher stiffened. There was something about the way she said it, the calculated way her words slithered into his brain, planting seeds of thoughts he had been too broken to entertain. "And what do you suggest?" he asked carefully. She smirked. "A partnership. I can give you the means to get back at Vanessa, to make her pay for what she did to you. But it won't be quick, and it won't be clean. You'll have to become something else. Something darker." Christopher studied her, weighing the cost of the temptation she dangled in front of him. Was revenge worth it? Was reclaiming his dignity worth the price he would undoubtedly have to pay? His fingers tightened around his glass as he met her gaze. "Tell me more." The woman's smile widened, victorious. "Oh, Christopher, I thought you'd never ask." Outside, the rain began to pour, washing away the filth of the streets. But inside, in the dim glow of the bar, something far darker was beginning to take shape, something that would ensure Vanessa's victory was nothing but temporary. The rain drummed against the windows of the penthouse suite, a rhythmic reminder of the storm raging both outside and within Christopher's mind. He stood at the edge of the floor-to-ceiling glass, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, his reflection staring back at him. The city below was alive, oblivious to the war brewing in his soul. The woman from the bar, her name was Evelyn, lounged on the leather couch behind him, legs crossed, exuding an air of quiet confidence. She had given him a proposition that night, one he hadn't immediately accepted. But the more he thought about it, the more it festered inside him like a slow-burning fire. "You haven't answered me yet," Evelyn said, her voice like silk wrapped around a blade. Christopher exhaled sharply, turning to face her. "You're asking me to go to war with Vanessa. That's not something you just jump into." Evelyn smiled. "It's not war. It's justice. She took everything from you. She left you with nothing. She left me alive." Evelyn tilted her head. "And that was her mistake." Christopher sat down across from her, the weight of the decision pressing against his chest. He had spent months wallowing in self-pity, drowning in whiskey, avoiding the reality of his situation. But something about Evelyn's presence awakened a part of him he thought had died, a hunger, a purpose. "What's your endgame?" he asked, studying her. Evelyn took a sip of her wine, eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Vanessa didn't just destroy you for revenge. She did it for control. And that's something I can't allow." Christopher frowned. "What are you talking about?" Evelyn leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Vanessa is expanding her reach. Your company was just the beginning. She's aligning herself with dangerous people, people who will cement her power in ways you never imagined." Christopher's jaw clenched. "You're telling me she's not done?" "She's just getting started." A long silence stretched between them before Christopher downed the rest of his whiskey and set the glass down with finality. "Tell me what you need me to do." Evelyn's smile was slow and knowing. "First, we dismantle her alliances. Then, we take back what's yours. And finally—" She let the words hang in the air, letting Christopher fill in the rest. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We bury her." Vanessa sat in the lavish lounge of her new estate, her legs elegantly crossed, a glass of red wine resting between her fingers. The world had been kind to her since she had destroyed Christopher. His empire was now hers, his contacts now bent to her will. But Vanessa was no fool. She knew a dethroned king was still dangerous if left unchecked. Her phone buzzed, and she answered without looking at the caller ID. "Speak." A deep voice hummed on the other end. "We have a problem." Vanessa's grip on her glass tightened. "What kind of problem?" "Christopher isn't staying down." Vanessa let out a slow breath. "I knew he wouldn't." "Who's helping him?" "That woman. Evelyn Black." Vanessa's lips curled slightly. "Evelyn. Now that's interesting." "She's dangerous," the voice warned. "More dangerous than you think." Vanessa swirled her wine, considering the information. "Then we make sure she doesn't become a problem." She ended the call and leaned back, a slow smirk playing on her lips. If Christopher wanted a war, he was about to find out just how ruthless she could be. Christopher and Evelyn spent the next few days gathering resources. Every connection Christopher still had was put to use, every favor called in. He wasn't as powerless as Vanessa had hoped. And with Evelyn by his side, they were methodically picking apart the foundation Vanessa had built. Late one night, Christopher and Evelyn sat in a dimly lit warehouse, a map of the city spread out before them. Red circles marked key locations, Vanessa's holdings, her business fronts, her hidden investments. "She's smart," Christopher admitted, tracing a finger over one of the locations. "She diversified her assets the moment she took over." "But she made one mistake," Evelyn said, tapping a particular mark on the map. "This." Christopher raised an eyebrow. "Her offshore accounts?" Evelyn nodded. "She's keeping a significant portion of her money in a vault overseas. We take that, and she's crippled." Christopher smirked. "You do know this isn't exactly legal." Evelyn leaned in, her voice laced with amusement. "Do you care?" Christopher held her gaze for a long moment before shaking his head. "Not even a little." As the plan took shape, Christopher felt something he hadn't in months, a renewed sense of purpose. Vanessa had underestimated him. She had left him broken, but not beaten. And now, he was coming for everything she had stolen. Vanessa stood in front of a tall window, watching the city lights flicker like dying stars. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, his expression grim. "We have another problem." Vanessa turned, raising an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Christopher." He nodded. "And he's making moves. He's targeting your offshore holdings." Vanessa's jaw tightened, but she remained composed. "Then it's time to remind Christopher who he's dealing with." She picked up her phone and dialed a number. When the line connected, she spoke with quiet authority. "I need him gone. Make it look like an accident." As she hung up, her smile was cold, merciless. Christopher had made his move. Now it was her turn. Christopher and Evelyn left the warehouse, stepping out into the cold night. The tension between them was electric, both of them knowing they were walking into dangerous territory. Evelyn glanced at him. "Are you ready for this?" Christopher exhaled, a wicked grin forming on his lips. "More than ever." But neither of them noticed the dark figure watching from the shadows, tracking their every move. The game had only just begun. Christopher stood at the edge of his dimly lit apartment, staring out at the city that once belonged to him. The skyline glowed with a brilliance that felt taunting, a cruel reminder of what he had lost. The weight of his choices pressed against his chest, yet a slow, simmering rage kept him upright. The woman from the bar, Sophia, had been true to her word. She had given him resources, connections, and more importantly, a reason to fight back. But revenge wasn't just a simple act of retaliation, it was a calculated game, and Christopher was willing to play for as long as it took. A knock at the door broke his trance. He walked over and opened it cautiously. Sophia stood there, draped in a black coat, her green eyes gleaming with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "Are you ready?" she asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Christopher closed the door and turned to face her. "Tell me what the next move is." She smirked, tossing a folder onto the table. "Vanessa thinks she's untouchable, but everyone has a weakness. She has skeletons, Christopher, and we're about to dig them up." He picked up the folder, flipping through photographs and documents. They were all connected to a man he recognized, Damien Holt, a name that carried weight in underground dealings. "She's been working with Holt?" Christopher asked, his jaw tightening. Sophia nodded. "Not just working. She's been laundering money through his network, covering her tracks well enough that no one's caught on yet. If this gets out, she won't just lose her reputation, she'll lose everything." Christopher exhaled, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in his mind. "How do we expose her?" Sophia's lips curled into a wicked smile. "By making sure she has nowhere to hide." The next day, Christopher put the first part of their plan into motion. He met with an old acquaintance, Julian Carter, a journalist who had a reputation for tearing apart the elite with nothing more than a well-placed article. Julian leaned back in his chair, sipping his espresso as he studied Christopher. "You want me to go after Vanessa?" That's a dangerous game. Christopher slid the folder across the table. This isn't just a scandal. This is criminal activity. If she goes down, she won't be walking away with a slap on the wrist. Julian flipped through the pages, his eyes widening slightly. If this is legit, then you just handed me the biggest story of the year. It's legit, Christopher confirmed. But you can't make your move yet. We need to tighten the noose first. Julian smirked. I like the way you think. Meanwhile, Vanessa sat in her office, unaware that the walls around her were beginning to close in. She had grown comfortable in her victory, underestimating the very man she had destroyed. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the contract she was reviewing. It was a message from an unknown number. You took everything from me. Now it's my turn. See. Vanessa's blood ran cold. She gripped the phone tightly, forcing herself to remain composed. Christopher was supposed to be broken, lost in the wreckage she had left behind. If he was coming for her, she would need to act first. She dialed a number, her voice cold and precise. I need you to find out what Christopher is up to. And if he becomes a problem, handle it. The voice on the other end responded without hesitation. Consider it done. Vanessa hung up, her fingers tapping against the desk. If Christopher wanted war, then war he would get. But she had no idea just how prepared he was. Christopher knew the game had shifted. Vanessa wasn't just playing defense anymore, she was preparing for war. He could feel it in the air, in the way the city pulsed with an undercurrent of danger. His every move had to be precise, calculated. One misstep, and he'd be the one buried instead. Sophia sat across from him in his apartment, her fingers drumming lightly against the table. Julian's working on the article, she said, her voice smooth but laced with urgency. But Vanessa isn't stupid. She's going to come after you before this ever sees the light of day. Christopher exhaled slowly. Then we make our move first. She arched a brow. What do you have in mind? A slow, dark smile spread across his face. We hit her where she least expects it. Vanessa was no stranger to threats. They came with power, and she had long since learned how to handle them. But this was different. Christopher wasn't sending a warning, he was making a statement. She needed to neutralize him before he could do any real damage. She sat in her office, watching the city lights flicker through the glass wall. Her contact, Damien Holt, sat across from her, his expression unreadable. You said you wanted insurance, he reminded her. That means handling this before it spirals out of control. Vanessa crossed her legs, her gaze sharp. Christopher has something on me. If he goes public with it, I'm finished. Damien leaned forward. Then let's make sure he doesn't get the chance. Christopher expected the ambush. He had spent too many years in this world to believe Vanessa would let him breathe long enough to destroy her. So when the men came for him that night, he was ready. The alleyway was dark, the air thick with tension. Christopher stepped out of the bar, his senses already on high alert. The first man lunged from the shadows, but Christopher ducked, sending a swift elbow into the attacker's ribs. A second man came at him from the side, but a gunshot echoed through the night before he could get close. Sophia stood a few feet away, her pistol raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Told you she'd send someone. Christopher glanced down at the wounded man groaning on the ground. Let's send a message back. Vanessa received the call an hour later. Her men had failed. Christopher wasn't just alive, he was retaliating. And now, she had blood on her hands that she hadn't intended to spill. A message awaited her when she returned to her penthouse. A single envelope, resting on her desk. Inside was a single photograph of one of her offshore accounts, one she thought was well hidden. A note was scrawled across the bottom. Not so untouchable now, are you? Vanessa clenched her jaw. Christopher wasn't backing down. And now, it was only a matter of who struck first. The war had truly begun. The city pulsed with tension, an invisible war brewing beneath the surface. Christopher knew Vanessa wouldn't take his last move lightly. He had delivered a warning, But she was the type of woman who didn't respond to warnings. She struck back harder. And this time, he needed to be ahead of her every move. Sophia sat at the edge of his couch, her eyes scanning the flickering city lights outside. "You rattled her," she murmured, taking a slow sip of her whiskey. "She won't let that slide." Christopher exhaled, leaning back. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." The air between them crackled with unspoken calculations, both of them knowing that the next move could determine everything. Sophia placed her glass down, her gaze steady. "We need to cut off her resources before she cuts off yours. Vanessa has power because of the money running through Holt's network. If we expose him along with her, she won't have anywhere to turn." Christopher nodded. "Julian is close to breaking the full story, but we need to get inside Holt's operation before it's too late." Sophia smirked, tilting her head. "Then it's a good thing I know someone on the inside." The warehouse on the outskirts of town was a fortress of illicit dealings, and Christopher hated walking into a trap. But tonight, he didn't have a choice. Sophia's contact, a man named Raoul, led them through the back entrance. The smell of metal and stale cigarettes lingered in the air, and the sound of muffled conversations echoed through the massive space. Holt was here. So was Vanessa. Christopher kept his expression neutral as they were led toward a glass-paneled office overlooking the warehouse floor. Inside, Damien Holt sat like a king on a throne, his cold gaze locked onto Vanessa as she paced. She was furious. Christopher could see it in the tight set of her shoulders, the sharp edge of her movements. "You said you'd handle him," Vanessa snapped at Holt. "Now he's in my business." Holt's gaze flickered toward Christopher and Sophia as they entered. He leaned back, his fingers tapping against the polished surface of his desk. "And yet, here he is. Interesting." Christopher smirked. "I've always been hard to kill." Vanessa turned, her eyes burning with rage. "You're making a mistake, Christopher. You have no idea what you're walking into." Christopher chuckled, stepping closer. "On the contrary, Vanessa. I know exactly what I'm doing." Holt watched the exchange with mild amusement. "Enough games. What do you want?" Christopher tossed a small flash drive onto the desk. "Everything I have on your operation. Bank accounts, transactions, connections. If this goes public, you and Vanessa both go down." Holt's jaw tightened, but Vanessa didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a slow, wicked curve of her lips. "And what do you want in exchange for your silence?" Christopher leaned in. "I want you to burn with me." Vanessa's eyes darkened, her hands curling into fists. But Holt only laughed, a deep, guttural sound. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that." Sophia crossed her arms. "The question is, Damien, how much is Vanessa really worth to you? Because right now, she's a liability." The room went silent. Christopher watched as Vanessa's mask of control slipped for the briefest moment. Holt was a businessman before anything else. And Vanessa had just become too expensive to protect. Holt exhaled through his nose, then turned to Vanessa. "You screwed up." Vanessa's face paled. "Damien, don't." He lifted a hand, silencing her. "If he walks out of here, so do I. You're on your own." For the first time since their war had begun, Christopher saw something flicker in Vanessa's eyes, something dangerously close to fear. Hours later, Christopher sat in his apartment, listening to the distant hum of sirens. Vanessa had lost her biggest ally. The walls around her were closing in. Sophia perched on the windowsill, watching him. "She won't go down easy." Christopher nodded. "She'll come for me with everything she has left." Sophia smirked. "Good. Then we finish this." The air was thick with the scent of smoke and expensive perfume. Vanessa sat alone in her dimly lit penthouse, the city lights twinkling below like dying embers. She had always known that the game she played was dangerous, but she had never expected Christopher to outmaneuver her so effectively. Holt had abandoned her, and without his protection, she was vulnerable. That thought made her grip her glass of whiskey tighter. Her phone vibrated on the glass coffee table. A message. She hesitated before picking it up, already knowing who it was. "Unknown number, you're running out of time." She scoffed, tossing the phone aside. The pressure was mounting, but she wasn't finished yet. If Christopher thought she would go down without a fight, he had severely underestimated her. Christopher leaned back in his chair, watching as Julian scrolled through the financial records they had extracted from Holt's network. Julian's eyes widened as he pieced together the money trail. "This is bigger than we thought," Julian murmured. Vanessa wasn't just laundering money through Holt. She was moving product for someone else. Someone bigger. Sophia leaned in, her brow furrowing. "Who?" Julian hesitated, then pulled up another file. "A syndicate known as the Argent Order. They don't usually operate in the open, but Vanessa was their key player in this city." Christopher's jaw tightened. "Which means if she's desperate, she's going to reach out to them." Sophia's expression darkened. "And they don't forgive failure." Vanessa strode into the underground club, her heels clicking against the floor as she made her way toward the VIP section. She knew this meeting was risky, but she had no other choice. If she didn't secure protection, Christopher would dismantle everything she had built. A tall man with ice-blue eyes waited for her in a secluded booth. He regarded her with amusement as she slid into the seat across from him. "Vanessa," he said smoothly, "I was wondering when you'd come crawling." She didn't flinch. "I need resources." The man chuckled, swirling his drink. "After your little fallout with Holt? I don't know if you're worth the investment." Vanessa leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "I still have contacts. I still have influence. Give me what I need, and I'll prove that I can turn this around." The man studied her for a long moment before smirking. "Fine. But if you fail again, you won't live to see another deal." Vanessa exhaled, masking her relief. "I won't fail." Christopher was waiting when Sophia walked into his apartment, her face set in a grim expression. "She's back in the game." Christopher nodded. "I expected that. The question is, how do we cut her off before she can regain control?" Julian's voice came through the speakerphone. "There's a shipment moving through the docks tomorrow night. If she's trying to restabilize her operations, that's where we hit her." Sophia smirked. "Then let's make sure she never recovers." The night was cold as Christopher, Sophia, and their small team positioned themselves near the docks. The cargo containers loomed like silent giants in the darkness. Christopher could feel the tension in the air as they waited for Vanessa's crew to arrive. When the first truck rolled in, Sophia signaled, "Showtime." As the deal began, Christopher and his team moved in swiftly. Gunfire erupted, chaos spreading as Vanessa's men tried to defend their shipment. In the middle of it all, Vanessa emerged, her face a mask of fury. She locked eyes with Christopher across the chaos. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Christopher raised his gun. "I don't make mistakes twice." A single shot rang out, and Vanessa staggered back, clutching her stomach. She fell to her knees, gasping as blood spread across her dress. The fight around them faded as her men either surrendered or fled. Sophia stepped up beside Christopher. "It's over." Vanessa's lips curled into a weak, bitter smile. "You think you've won?" Christopher crouched beside her, his voice low. "You lost the moment you betrayed me." Her eyes darkened, but she said nothing more. As the sirens grew closer, Christopher turned away, leaving Vanessa to her fate. This time, there was no escape. The storm raged outside, rain hammering against the windows as Christopher stood in the penthouse suite, staring at the city below. He had won, but victory felt hollow. Vanessa was gone, her empire dismantled, but something still gnawed at him. Sophia entered the room, shaking off her wet coat. "It's done," she said, watching Christopher closely. "Her contacts are either dead or running. The Argent Order won't be using this city anymore." Christopher nodded, but his hands clenched at his sides. "And Julian? He's tying up loose ends at the docks. He'll meet us later." The weight of everything settled on Christopher's shoulders. He had fought too long, lost too much. But he wasn't done yet. Julian walked through the wreckage of the docks, his gun still warm in his hand. Bodies littered the ground, the last remnants of Vanessa's empire. He had known this was the only way it could end, but something felt off. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. She's still alive. His breath caught. No. That wasn't possible. He had seen her fall. Seen her bleed out on the cold pavement. A second message followed. You didn't finish the job. Now it's your turn. Julian's blood ran cold. He spun around, scanning the shadows. The docks were too quiet. His instincts screamed at him to move, but before he could react, a shot rang out. Pain exploded through his chest. He staggered, dropping his gun, the ground rushing up to meet him. Sophia's phone rang as she and Christopher stepped into the car. She answered, her face tightening as she listened. Julian's dead. Christopher's grip on the steering wheel tightened. How? Shot at the docks. Someone got to him. A slow, creeping dread filled the car. Christopher exchanged a look with Sophia, and without a word, he turned the car around. They had missed something. Someone. The hospital was eerily quiet as Vanessa sat in the shadows of a private suite, bandages wrapped tightly around her wounds. The man in front of her grinned as he poured a drink. I told you I'd come through, he said. Vanessa smirked weakly, taking the glass. And Christopher? The man shrugged. He thinks you're dead. That's all that matters. She sipped her drink, her eyes darkening. Not for long. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.